The Library of Alexandria stands as history's most magnificent symbol of human knowledge and learning, a beacon of intellectual achievement that illuminated the ancient world for nearly 7 centuries. Rising from the fertile delta of the Nile River around 295 BCE, this extraordinary institution represented far more than a simple collection of scrolls and manuscripts. It embodied the revolutionary vision of Alexander the Great and his successors, who sought to gather all human knowledge under one roof and make it accessible to the greatest minds of their age. The story begins not in Alexandria itself, but in the conquests of Alexander the Great, whose military campaigns between 334 and 323 BC created the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. As Alexander's armies swept across Asia Minor, Persia, and into India, they encountered diverse civilizations with rich intellectual traditions spanning mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature. The young Macedonian king, tutored by Aristotle himself, understood that lasting conquest required more than military victory. It demanded the integration and preservation of the knowledge systems that sustained these great civilizations. When Alexander founded Alexandria in 331 BCE on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, he chose the location with strategic brilliance. The site commanded the approaches to the Nile Delta while maintaining access to Mediterranean trade routes that connected Europe, Africa, and Asia. More importantly, Egypt's position as the crossroads of the ancient world made it the ideal location for gathering scholars and texts from across the known world. Alexander's death in 323 BCE, at the age of 32, threatened to fragment his vast empire among his competing generals. However, Ptolemy I Soter, who claimed Egypt as his portion of the inheritance, possessed both the vision and resources necessary to transform Alexandria into something unprecedented in human history. Ptolemy had served as one of Alexander's most trusted commanders and understood his former leader as intellectual ambitions. More crucially, Ptolemy recognized that Egypt's immense agricultural wealth, generated by the predictable flooding of the Nile, could finance an unprecedented investment in learning and scholarship. The conception of the library emerged from Ptolemy's desire to legitimize his rule over Egypt's native population, while establishing Alexandria as the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world. Unlike previous royal libraries that served primarily ceremonial functions, Ptolemy envisioned an institution that would actively collect, preserve, and expand human knowledge through systematic research and scholarship. This vision required unprecedented financial commitment, sophisticated organizational systems, and the recruitment of the ancient world's most brilliant minds. Ptolemy's first crucial decision involved appointing Demetrius of Phalerum as the library's founding director around 295 BCE. Demetrius brought exceptional qualifications to this position. Having served as the philosophical ruler of Athens under Macedonian oversight and maintained extensive connections throughout the Greek intellectual community, his background as both a practical administrator and theoretical philosopher proved essential for translating Ptolemy's ambitious vision into functional institutional reality. Under Demetrius's guidance, the library's foundational principles took shape through careful study of existing intellectual institutions, particularly Aristotle's Lyceum in Athens. However, the Alexandrian model would far surpass its predecessors in scope and ambition. Where the Lyceum focused primarily on philosophical inquiry within the Greek tradition, the library would actively seek knowledge from every known civilization, creating the ancient world's first truly international center for learning and research. The library's physical construction began around 290 BCE as part of a larger complex known as the Mausoleum, or Shrine of the Muses. This name reflected the institution's sacred character within Greek culture, where the 9 muses presided over different aspects of learning and artistic creation. The complex occupied a significant portion of Alexandria's royal quarter, adjacent to the royal palace and connected to the city's harbor through covered walkways that allowed scholars to access newly arrived manuscripts without exposure to the elements. Archaeological evidence suggests the library building itself rose several stories above the Alexandrian skyline, with reading rooms, copying scriptoriums, lecture halls, and storage chambers designed to house hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The architecture incorporated advanced ventilation systems to prevent moisture damage, fireproof storage areas constructed from stone and brick, and sophisticated cataloging areas where librarians could organize and cross-reference the collection's contents. The library's acquisition strategy proved as revolutionary as its physical design. Rather than relying on donations or purchases alone, Ptolemy I decreed that every ship entering Alexandria Ice Harbor must surrender any books or manuscripts aboard for copying. The original texts were retained for the library's collection, while copies were returned to their owners, along with compensation for their inconvenience. This aggressive acquisition policy, though controversial, ensured rapid growth in the collection's size and diversity. More significantly, the Ptolemies established a systematic translation program that would prove crucial for preserving knowledge across linguistic boundaries. Teams of bilingual scholars worked continuously to translate important texts from Babylonian, Persian, Indian, Hebrew, and other languages into Greek, the library's primary working language. These translation efforts preserved works that would otherwise have been lost when their original civilizations declined, creating a comprehensive repository of human intellectual achievement. The library's early decades witnessed unprecedented scholarly productivity as the world's leading intellectuals gathered in Alexandria to pursue research under royal patronage. The Ptolemies provided scholars with generous stipends, free housing, meals, and access to the entire collection, creating conditions that allowed for focused, long-term research projects impossible elsewhere in the ancient world. Among the brilliant minds who transformed Alexandria into the ancient world's intellectual capital, Euclid stands as perhaps the most enduring example of the library's scholarly achievements. Arriving in Alexandria around 300 BCE during the institution's earliest years, Euclid established a mathematical school within the library complex that would fundamentally reshape human understanding of geometry and mathematical reasoning. His masterwork, The Elements, composed entirely within the library's halls, remained the standard mathematical textbook for over 2,000 years and continues to influence mathematical education today. The Elements represented more than individual brilliance. It exemplified the collaborative intellectual environment that made the library unique. Euclid drew upon mathematical traditions from Babylonia, Egypt, and earlier Greek mathematicians, synthesizing diverse approaches into a coherent logical system. The library's vast collection provided access to mathematical texts that would have been impossible to gather elsewhere, while conversations with fellow scholars from different cultural backgrounds enriched his understanding of alternative mathematical approaches. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as the library's chief librarian from approximately 245 to 194 BCE, demonstrated the institution's commitment to empirical investigation and scientific methodology. His calculation of Earth's circumference, achieved through careful measurement of shadow angles in Alexandria and Syene, represented one of the most remarkable scientific achievements of the ancient world. Using only basic geometric principles and meticulous observation, Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference to within remarkable accuracy, demonstrating the power of systematic scientific inquiry. But Eratosthenes' contributions extended far beyond mathematics and geography. As chief librarian, he developed sophisticated cataloging systems that enabled scholars to navigate the library's massive collection efficiently. His Pinaques, or tables, created the ancient world's most comprehensive bibliography, organizing works by author, subject, and literary form. This cataloging innovation established principles of library science that influenced institutional organization for centuries. The library's influence on astronomical knowledge proves equally remarkable. Aristarchus of Samos, working within the library's scholarly community around 270 BCE, proposed the revolutionary hypothesis that Earth orbited the Sun rather than serving as the center of the universe. Though this heliocentric model would not gain acceptance until Copernicus revived it nearly 18 centuries later, Aristarchus' work demonstrates the intellectual freedom and innovative thinking that the library fostered. Apollonius of Perga advanced mathematical understanding through his studies of conic sections, developing geometric principles that would later prove essential for understanding planetary orbits and projectile motion. His work, Conics, produced entirely within the library's supportive environment, established mathematical foundations that remained cutting-edge until the Renaissance. The library's medical school, led by figures like Eriphilus and Erasistratus, revolutionized understanding of human anatomy and physiology. These physicians conducted the ancient world's first systematic dissections of human cadavers, discoveries that were only possible due to the library's connection with Alexandria's cosmopolitan culture, where Egyptian mummification practices had reduced cultural taboos surrounding human dissection. Eriphilus identified the brain as the center of intelligence, distinguishing between sensory and motor nerves, and provided the first accurate descriptions of the heart's function as a pump. Erasistratus described a circulatory system with remarkable accuracy, nearly discovering blood circulation 17 centuries before William Harvey. Their anatomical texts, preserved through the library's copying programs, transmitted crucial medical knowledge to Islamic scholars who would later reintroduce these concepts to medieval Europe. The library's literary achievements proved equally impressive. Callimachus of Cyrene, serving simultaneously as poet and bibliographer, created literary works that defined Hellenistic aesthetic standards, while developing cataloging systems that organized the library's literary holdings. His hymns, epigrams, and scholarly commentaries established literary models that influenced poetry and criticism throughout the ancient world. Apollonius of Rhodes composed his epic poem Argonautica within the library's scholarly environment, creating a work that rivaled Homer's epics in scope and sophistication. The poem's complex narrative structure and psychological depth reflected the advanced literary criticism and theoretical frameworks that emerged from sustained scholarly interaction within the library community. The institution's commitment to preserving and transmitting knowledge extended beyond individual scholarly achievements to systematic educational programs. The library functioned as the ancient world's first graduate school, attracting advanced students from across the Mediterranean who sought training under the era's leading intellectuals. These students carried Alexandrian scholarly methods and discoveries back to their home cities, creating networks of learning that extended the library's influence far beyond Egypt's borders. The Ptolemaic rulers understood that the library's success depended on maintaining generous financial support for both collection development and scholarly research. Royal patronage covered not only basic operational expenses, but also funded expeditions to acquire rare texts, translation projects that made foreign works accessible to Greek scholars, and copying programs that preserved fragile manuscripts for future generations. This financial commitment proved enormous by ancient standards. Conservative estimates suggest the Ptolemies invested the equivalent of hundreds of millions of modern dollars annually in library operations, treating scholarly investment as essential state policy rather than optional luxury. The rulers recognized that Alexandria's intellectual preeminence translated directly into political influence and economic advantage throughout the Mediterranean world. The library's acquisition strategies became increasingly sophisticated during its golden age. Beyond the famous policy of copying manuscripts from ships entering Alexandria's harbor, the Ptolemies established networks of agents throughout the ancient world who identified important texts and negotiated their acquisition or copying rights. These agents operated in Athens, Rome, Babylon, Pergamon, and other intellectual centers, creating an international intelligence network focused on locating valuable knowledge. The institution's translation programs represented perhaps its most significant long-term contribution to human civilization. The famous Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, completed under Ptolemy II around 250 BCE, exemplified the library's systematic approach to making important texts accessible across linguistic boundaries. This translation not only preserved Hebrew religious traditions, but also facilitated the spread of monotheistic concepts throughout the Greek-speaking world. The translation programs initiated under the early Ptolemies transformed Alexandria into a crucible of cross-cultural intellectual exchange unprecedented in the ancient world. Beyond the Septuagint, library scholars undertook systematic translations of Babylonian astronomical texts, Persian religious writings, Indian mathematical treatises, and Egyptian medical papyri. These translation efforts created a unique intellectual synthesis that combined Greek rational methodology with the empirical knowledge accumulated by older civilizations. The translation of Babylonian astronomical records proved particularly significant for advancing scientific knowledge. These ancient observations, spanning centuries of careful celestial recording, provided Greek astronomers with datasets far more comprehensive than any single lifetime of observation could produce. Hipparchus of Nicaea, working with these translated records around 150 BCE, discovered the precession of the equinoxes and created the first accurate star catalog, achievements that would have been impossible without access to Babylonian observational data preserved through the library as translation programs. Similarly, the translation of Indian mathematical texts introduced Greek scholars to advanced numerical concepts, including early forms of algebraic thinking and sophisticated astronomical calculations. These cross-cultural mathematical exchanges contributed to the development of trigonometry and advanced geometric techniques that enhanced both theoretical understanding and practical applications in engineering and architecture. By the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled from 283 to 246 BCE, the library had grown to house an estimated 400,000 individual scrolls, with some ancient sources claiming the collection eventually reached 700,000 volumes. These numbers, while impressive, require careful interpretation since ancient books consisted of papyrus scrolls that might contain what we would consider chapters or sections of larger works. Nevertheless, the scale of the collection dwarfed any other library in the ancient world and represented a significant portion of all recorded human knowledge. The library's physical expansion during this period required innovative architectural solutions to accommodate the growing collection while maintaining preservation standards and scholarly access. New storage wings incorporated advanced climate control systems that used underground chambers and carefully designed ventilation to maintain consistent temperature and humidity levels. Specialized copying halls employed dozens of professional scribes who worked continuously to produce duplicate copies of important texts, ensuring preservation against loss or damage. The institution's scholarly community during its golden age resembled a modern research university, with established hierarchies of senior scholars, junior researchers, and advanced students. The position of chief librarian carried enormous prestige throughout the intellectual world, with appointees typically chosen from among the era's most distinguished scholars. These librarians served not merely as administrators, but as active researchers who made significant contributions to knowledge while overseeing the institution's operations. Apollodorus of Athens, serving as librarian during the 2nd century BCE, exemplified this tradition of scholar administrators. His Chronicon, a comprehensive chronological history of the Greek world, became the standard historical reference work for centuries and demonstrated the type of synthetic scholarship that the library's resources enabled. By having access to historical records from multiple civilizations and cultures, Apollodorus could create historical narratives that transcended the limited perspectives of individual city-states or kingdoms. However, even during the library's golden age, political tensions within the Ptolemaic kingdom began to threaten the institution's stability and independence. The cost of maintaining such an extensive scholarly establishment placed enormous strain on Egypt's treasury, particularly as the kingdom faced increasing military pressures from Rome and other expanding powers. Successive Ptolemaic rulers found themselves forced to choose between funding military expenditures and supporting scholarly activities. The rise of Pergamon as a rival intellectual center during the 2nd century BCE created the ancient world's first serious competition for scholarly talent and rare manuscripts. The Attalid kings of Pergamon, seeking to enhance their cultural prestige, established their own library and museum complex that actively competed with Alexandria for both scholars and texts. This competition drove up the costs of acquiring manuscripts and recruiting prominent intellectuals, straining the financial resources that both institutions required for continued growth. The famous rivalry between Alexandria and Pergamon extended beyond simple competition to active intellectual warfare. When the Ptolemies attempted to prevent papyrus exports to Pergamon to limit their rivals' manuscript production, the Pergamenes responded by developing parchment as an alternative writing material. This innovation, derived from treated animal skins, proved more durable than papyrus and eventually revolutionized book production throughout the ancient world. The political instability that plagued Egypt during the late Ptolemaic period increasingly affected the library's operations and scholarly activities. Court intrigues, succession disputes, and civil wars diverted royal attention and resources away from intellectual pursuits toward more immediate political and military concerns. The institution's international character, which had been a source of strength during stable periods, became a liability as foreign scholars found themselves caught up in domestic political conflicts. The Romans' growing influence in Egyptian affairs during the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE introduced additional complications for the library's operations. Roman officials and merchants, while often appreciative of Greek learning, possessed different cultural values that emphasized practical applications over theoretical inquiry. This shift in cultural priorities gradually reduced support for the type of abstract research that had characterized the library's golden age. The arrival of Julius Caesar in Alexandria during 48 BC marked a crucial turning point in the library's history. Caesar's pursuit of Pompey after their civil war brought him into direct contact with the institution that had fascinated Roman intellectuals for centuries. However, the military conflict that erupted in Alexandria's harbor during Caesar's siege would inflict the first major physical damage to the library's collection and facilities. The famous fire that occurred during Caesar's occupation of Alexandria destroyed significant portions of the library's holdings, though the exact extent of the damage remains debated among historians. Some sources suggest that the fire consumed the entire collection, while others indicate that only the harborside storage areas were affected. Modern scholarly consensus suggests that while the fire caused substantial losses, the library continued to function and retain significant portions of its collection. More importantly than the immediate physical damage, Caesar's occupation demonstrated the library's vulnerability to political upheaval and military conflict. The institution's previous protection under Ptolemaic patronage could no longer be guaranteed as Egypt's independence eroded under increasing Roman pressure. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE, following the deaths of Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII, fundamentally transformed the library's institutional character and scholarly mission. Augustus Caesar's establishment of Egypt as a Roman province subjected the library to imperial administrative oversight that prioritized practical utility over theoretical inquiry. While Roman rulers continued to support the institution financially, their patronage came with expectations that scholarly work should serve imperial interests rather than pursue knowledge for its own sake. Under Roman rule, the library's collection development shifted focus from comprehensive acquisition of all available knowledge to selective gathering of texts deemed useful for imperial administration, military engineering, and economic development. Roman officials showed particular interest in geographical works that could facilitate conquest and governance, medical texts that could improve military healthcare, and engineering treatises that could enhance infrastructure development throughout the empire. Despite these changing priorities, the library continued to attract distinguished scholars who made significant contributions to human knowledge. Claudius Ptolemy, working in Alexandria during the 2nd century CE, produced his Almagest, a comprehensive astronomical treatise that would remain the standard reference work on celestial mechanics for over a millennium. Ptolemy's geocentric model of the universe, while ultimately incorrect, represented the most sophisticated mathematical description of planetary motion achieved in the ancient world. Ptolemy's geography, also compiled within the library's scholarly environment, established cartographic principles and geographical knowledge that guided exploration and trade for centuries. His systematic approach to map-making, coordinate systems, and geographical description created frameworks that would influence European exploration well into the Renaissance period. The survival of Ptolemy's works demonstrates the library's continued importance as a center for scholarly synthesis, even under changing political conditions. Hero of Alexandria, working during the 1st century CE, exemplified the Roman period's emphasis on practical applications of theoretical knowledge. His mechanical innovations, including the first recorded steam engine, automated door-opening systems, and programmable theatrical devices, emerged from the intersection of Greek mathematical principles with Roman engineering pragmatism. Hero's works preserved within the library documented not only his own innovations, but also earlier mechanical knowledge from various civilizations. The library's medical school continued to flourish under Roman patronage, benefiting from the empire's extensive military medical needs. Physicians working in Alexandria had access to trauma cases and surgical experience unavailable in more peaceful settings, while the library's vast medical literature provided theoretical foundations for innovative treatments. Galen of Pergamon, though not permanently based in Alexandria, studied there extensively and drew upon the library's medical collections for his comprehensive anatomical and physiological works. However, the Roman period also witnessed the beginning of systematic neglect that would eventually contribute to the library's decline. Imperial administrators, focused on immediate political and military concerns, gradually reduced funding for collection maintenance, scholarly stipends, and building upkeep. The institution's international character, which had attracted scholars from across the ancient world, diminished as Roman citizenship requirements and political restrictions limited foreign access. The rise of Christianity during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE introduced new tensions that profoundly affected the library's operations and scholarly mission. Early Christian leaders viewed much of the library's collection, particularly philosophical and religious texts from non-Christian traditions, with suspicion and hostility. The institution's association with pagan learning made it a target for Christian reformers who sought to replace classical education with religious instruction. The appointment of Christian bishops to positions of civic authority in Alexandria created direct conflicts between religious and scholarly priorities. Bishop Theophilus, who served from 385 to 412 CE, actively campaigned against pagan institutions and practices, viewing the library as a symbol of the pre-Christian intellectual culture that Christianity needed to replace. His destruction of the Serapeum Temple complex in 391 CE eliminated one of the library's major satellite collections and demonstrated the vulnerability of scholarly institutions to religious zealotry. The most dramatic confrontation between Christian authority and Alexandrian scholarship occurred during the early 5th century CE around the figure of Hypatia, a brilliant mathematician and philosopher who represented the library's continuing intellectual tradition. Hypatia's lectures on mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy attracted students from across the Mediterranean, maintaining Alexandria's reputation as a center of learning despite changing political and religious conditions. Hypatia's brutal murder in 415 CE by a Christian mob, instigated by Bishop Cyril, marked a symbolic end to the library's golden age of scholarship. Her death demonstrated that even the most distinguished scholars could not rely on traditional protections when religious and political passions overwhelmed rational discourse. Many surviving pagan scholars fled Alexandria following Hypatia's murder, carrying their knowledge to other centers of learning, but leaving the library intellectually impoverished. The 7th century CE brought new challenges as the Byzantine Empire struggled to maintain control over Egypt against increasing external pressures. The Persian conquest of Alexandria in 619 CE disrupted the library's operations and scattered much of its remaining scholarly community. Though Byzantine forces recaptured the city in 629 CE, the damage to institutional continuity proved difficult to repair. The Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE, under the command of Amr ibn al-As, introduced Islamic rule to Egypt and fundamentally altered the cultural context within which the library operated. The new rulers, while not necessarily hostile to learning, represented a different intellectual tradition with its own priorities and methodologies. Arabic replaced Greek as the dominant scholarly language, requiring massive translation efforts to make the library's collections accessible to new generations of scholars. Contrary to later myths that blamed Arab conquerors for destroying the library, historical evidence suggests that Islamic rulers generally supported learning and scholarship. The early Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs established their own libraries and translation programs, often drawing upon Alexandrian manuscripts and scholars. The famous House of Wisdom in Baghdad inherited much of the library as intellectual legacy through these translation efforts. However, the gradual decline of Alexandria as importance as a political and economic center reduced the resources available for maintaining the library's extensive operations. As Islamic civilization's intellectual centers shifted to Damascus, Baghdad, and Cordoba, Alexandria found itself increasingly peripheral to the scholarly networks that had once centered on its institutions. The library's physical deterioration accelerated during the medieval period as earthquakes, floods, and neglect took their toll on buildings that had housed humanity's greatest collection of knowledge. The library's physical deterioration accelerated during the medieval period as earthquakes, floods, and neglect took their toll on buildings that had housed humanity's greatest collection of knowledge for nearly a millennium. The great earthquake of 365 CE had already damaged much of Alexandria's ancient architecture, including portions of the library complex, while subsequent seismic events throughout the 6th and 7th centuries caused additional structural failures that made preservation increasingly difficult. By the 8th century CE, travelers to Alexandria reported that the once magnificent library buildings had fallen into serious disrepair. The vast reading halls where Euclid had taught geometry and Eratosthenes had calculated Earth's circumference now stood empty. Their roofs collapsed and their carefully designed ventilation systems clogged with debris. The specialized storage areas that had once protected hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls from moisture and fire, damage could no longer fulfill their preservation functions. The final disappearance of the library as a functioning institution occurred, gradually over several centuries, rather than through any single catastrophic event. As the remaining manuscripts deteriorated beyond readability and the last scholars departed for more promising intellectual centers, the library simply ceased to exist as a living institution. By the 10th century CE, Islamic historians writing about Alexandria's past described the library in purely historical terms, acknowledging its former greatness while confirming its complete disappearance from contemporary intellectual life. The question of what knowledge vanished with the library's destruction haunts historians and scholars to this day. Conservative estimates suggest that the collection contained works representing the intellectual achievements of dozens of ancient civilizations, spanning over 1,000 years of human development. The loss included not only individual texts, but entire intellectual traditions, scientific methodologies, and cultural perspectives that could have fundamentally altered the course of human knowledge. Perhaps most tragically, the library's destruction eliminated comprehensive records of ancient, scientific observations and experimental results that modern science has had to rediscover through centuries of painstaking research. Babylonian astronomical observations spanning over a millennium, Egyptian medical knowledge accumulated through thousands of years of clinical practice, and Indian mathematical innovations that predated European developments by centuries, all disappeared when the library's collections were lost. The literary losses prove equally devastating when considered in their full scope. The library housed the complete works of hundreds of ancient authors, whose names survive only in fragmentary references or later quotations. Entire genres of ancient literature, including scientific poetry, historical epics, and philosophical dialogues, vanished completely, leaving modern scholars with only tantalizing hints about intellectual achievements that might have rivaled or surpassed anything preserved in later traditions. The impact of these losses on subsequent intellectual development cannot be overstated. The European Renaissance required centuries of painstaking effort to recover even a fraction of the scientific and philosophical knowledge that had been readily available to scholars in ancient Alexandria. Mathematical concepts that Greek scholars had fully developed were lost and had to be rediscovered through contact with Islamic civilization, which had preserved some Alexandrian knowledge through translation programs. The library's destruction also eliminated unique opportunities for cross-cultural, intellectual synthesis that would not be replicated until the modern era. The institution's systematic translation programs had created unprecedented opportunities for scholars from different cultural backgrounds to compare methodologies, share observations, and develop synthetic approaches that transcended individual cultural limitations. The loss of this intellectual diversity impoverished human knowledge in ways that extended far beyond the simple destruction of individual texts. Modern archaeological efforts to locate and excavate the library as remains have faced enormous challenges due to Alexandria's continuous habitation and the Mediterranean Sea's encroachment on ancient coastal areas. Underwater archaeology has revealed portions of the royal quarter where the library was located, but identifying specific library structures among the submerged ruins remains difficult due to the similarity of ancient architectural styles and the extensive damage caused by earthquakes and erosion. Recent excavations in Alexandria as modern city center have uncovered what may have been lecture halls and storage areas associated with the ancient library complex. These discoveries include sophisticated drainage systems, fireproof construction techniques, and specialized architectural features that suggest advanced understanding of preservation requirements. However, the absence of organic materials like papyrus scrolls in the archaeological record means that direct evidence of the library's collections remains elusive. The symbolic power of the library's loss has inspired numerous modern attempts to recreate its vision of universal knowledge collection and accessibility. The construction of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina in 2002, built near the site of the ancient library, represents the most ambitious effort to revive the Alexandrian tradition in the modern era. This new institution seeks to combine traditional library functions with digital preservation techniques and international scholarly collaboration that reflect contemporary approaches to knowledge preservation and dissemination. Digital humanities projects worldwide have attempted to recreate virtually the intellectual environment that the ancient library provided for scholars. Online databases, digital manuscript collections, and collaborative research platforms represent modern equivalents to the library as systematic translation programs and comprehensive collection development strategies. These projects demonstrate both the continuing relevance of the library-us mission and the technological possibilities for preserving human knowledge against future catastrophes. The library-s influence on subsequent institutional development can be traced through Islamic libraries like Baghdad's House of Wisdom, medieval European monastery libraries, Renaissance humanist collections, and modern research universities. Each of these institutions inherited aspects of the Alexandrian model while adapting it to different cultural contexts and technological possibilities. The basic principles of systematic collection development, scholarly collaboration, and knowledge preservation established at Alexandria continue to guide institutional libraries and research centers throughout the world. Contemporary parallels between the libraries as vulnerabilities and modern threats to knowledge preservation provide sobering lessons for digital age scholarship. Just as political instability, religious extremism, and economic pressures contributed to the library's decline, modern knowledge institutions face similar challenges from funding cuts, technological obsolescence, and cultural conflicts over intellectual freedom. The library's history demonstrates both the fragility of human knowledge and the enormous losses that can result when societies fail to prioritize scholarship and learning. The story of Alexandria's library ultimately represents humanity's greatest intellectual tragedy and its most inspiring vision of what collaborative scholarship can achieve. The story of Alexandria's library ultimately represents humanity's greatest intellectual tragedy and its most inspiring vision of what collaborative scholarship can achieve. When we examine the full scope of what was created and subsequently lost, we confront fundamental questions about how civilizations preserve knowledge and what responsibilities we bear toward future generations of learners and thinkers. The scale of intellectual achievement that flourished within the library's walls defies easy comprehension. For nearly 7 centuries, the world's brightest minds gathered in Alexandria to push the boundaries of human understanding across every field of inquiry. Mathematicians developed geometric principles that would remain unchanged for millennia. Astronomers mapped celestial movements with precision that wouldn't be matched until the telescope's invention. And physicians performed anatomical studies that provided medical knowledge centuries ahead of their time. Consider the revolutionary nature of what the Ptolemies accomplished in establishing the library. No previous civilization had attempted to collect and preserve all human knowledge within a single institution. Egyptian temples had maintained religious texts, Mesopotamian palaces had kept administrative records, and Greek philosophical schools had preserved their particular intellectual traditions. But Alexandria represented something entirely unprecedented. A systematic effort to gather every significant text from every known culture and make this knowledge available to qualified scholars regardless of their ethnic or cultural background. This universalist approach to knowledge required not only unprecedented financial investment, but also remarkable cultural sophistication. The Ptolemaic rulers had to overcome deeply ingrained prejudices that viewed foreign customs and ideas as inherently inferior to Greek traditions. The systematic translation programs that converted Babylonian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Persian philosophy, and Hebrew religious texts into Greek created the ancient world's first truly multicultural intellectual environment. The collaborative research methodology that emerged within the library's scholarly community established patterns of academic cooperation that would not be replicated until the modern university system developed during the medieval period. Scholars from different cultural backgrounds worked together on complex problems, sharing methodologies and comparing results in ways that enhanced everyone's understanding. This collaborative approach proved particularly crucial for advancing mathematical and scientific knowledge, where individual insights could be tested and refined through group discussion and debate. The library's sophisticated organizational systems represented another. remarkable innovation that influenced institutional development for centuries. The cataloging methods developed by scholars like Callimachus and Eratosthenes created the first comprehensive bibliographic systems in human history. These organizational tools enabled researchers to locate relevant materials efficiently within the vast collection, while also identifying gaps in knowledge that required additional research or acquisition efforts. The institution's educational programs transformed Alexandria into the ancient world's premier graduate school, attracting advanced students who carried Alexandrian scholarly methods back to their home cities throughout the Mediterranean world. This educational outreach created networks of learning that extended the library's intellectual influence far beyond Egypt's borders, establishing Alexandria as the acknowledged center of scholarly excellence for the entire Hellenistic world. When we contemplate what knowledge disappeared with the library's destruction, the losses extend far beyond the individual texts to encompass entire ways of thinking about natural phenomena and human experience. The library housed complete works of authors whose fragmentary remains suggest intellectual achievements that might have fundamentally altered subsequent cultural and scientific development. We possess tantalizing references to lost works on advanced mathematics, experimental medicine, mechanical engineering, and astronomical observation that could have accelerated human understanding by centuries. The destruction of comprehensive historical records represents another incalculable loss. The library contained detailed chronicles of ancient civilizations that provided comparative perspectives on political development, social organization, and cultural achievement. These historical materials could have enabled earlier recognition of recurring patterns in human behavior and social development that modern historians have had to reconstruct through fragmentary evidence and archaeological investigation. Perhaps most tragically, the library's loss eliminated the intellectual synthesis that had emerged from sustained interaction between different cultural traditions. Greek rational methodology combined with Babylonian empirical observation, Egyptian practical knowledge merged with Indian theoretical speculation, and Persian philosophical insights enriched Hebrew theological reflection. This unique intellectual fusion created new approaches to understanding natural phenomena and human experience that vanished completely when the library scholarly community dispersed. The circumstances surrounding the library's decline provide sobering lessons about the vulnerability of intellectual institutions to political upheaval, religious extremism, and economic pressure. The gradual reduction in royal support, increasing political instability, and growing religious hostility toward pagan learning created conditions that made the library's survival impossible despite its enormous cultural value and scholarly achievements. Modern efforts to understand and commemorate the library's legacy demonstrate both the continuing fascination with its achievements and the difficulty of comprehending what was lost. Digital reconstruction projects attempt to recreate the intellectual environment that enabled such remarkable scholarly productivity, while archaeological investigations seek physical evidence of the buildings and artifacts that supported this extraordinary institution. The contemporary relevance of the library's story becomes particularly apparent when we consider current threats to knowledge preservation and intellectual freedom. Political conflicts, religious extremism, and economic pressures continue to threaten libraries, universities, and research institutions worldwide. The destruction of manuscripts in Timbuktu, the bombing of libraries in Iraq and Syria, and funding cuts to academic institutions demonstrate that the forces that destroyed the Library of Alexandria remain active threats to human knowledge. The digital age presents both new opportunities and new vulnerabilities for knowledge preservation. While digital technologies enable unprecedented access to information and collaborative research possibilities, they also create new forms of fragility through technological obsolescence, cyber attacks, and corporate control over access systems. The library's history reminds us that preserving human knowledge requires sustained institutional commitment and protection against the forces that prioritize immediate political or economic interests over long-term intellectual development. As we reflect on the complete history of the Library of Alexandria, we must acknowledge both what was lost and what was preserved. Though the physical institution disappeared, its intellectual legacy influenced subsequent centers of learning throughout the Islamic world, medieval Europe, and the modern university system. As we reflect on the complete history of the Library of Alexandria, we must acknowledge both what was lost and what was preserved. Though the physical institution disappeared, its intellectual legacy influenced subsequent centers of learning throughout the Islamic world, medieval Europe, and the modern university system. The translation movement that flourished in 9th century Baghdad drew directly upon Alexandrian precedents. As Islamic scholars systematically translated Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic, preserving crucial knowledge that would otherwise have vanished entirely. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established by the Abbasid caliphs, consciously modeled itself on the Library of Alexandria, seeking to collect and translate knowledge from all available sources. Islamic scholars like Hunayn ibn Ishaq and his translation school worked with the same systematic methodology that had characterized Alexandrian scholarship, creating Arabic versions of Greek mathematical, medical, and philosophical texts that would later be retranslated into Latin during the European Renaissance. This chain of preservation demonstrates how the library's vision of universal knowledge collection transcended the institution's physical destruction. The intellectual methods and organizational principles developed in Alexandria continued to influence scholarship long after the building itself had crumbled and its scrolls had turned to dust. The systematic approach to translation, the collaborative research methodology, and the comprehensive collection development strategies pioneered in Alexandria became standard practices in subsequent centers of learning. The medieval Islamic world's greatest libraries in Cordoba, Cairo, and Baghdad all incorporated Alexandrian organizational principles while adapting them to their own cultural contexts and technological possibilities. These institutions preserved not only specific texts that had originated in Alexandria, but also the broader intellectual framework that had made the library's scholarly achievements possible. When European scholars began encountering Islamic libraries during the Crusades and through commercial contacts, they were essentially rediscovering their own classical heritage, filtered through the preservational efforts that had begun in Alexandria. The Renaissance recovery of classical learning depended heavily upon texts that had survived through this Alexandrian Islamic preservation network. When Byzantine refugees brought Greek manuscripts to Western Europe following Constantinople's fall in 1453, many of these texts traced their intellectual lineage back to copies that had been made in the Library of Alexandria over a millennium earlier. The scientific revolution that transformed European understanding during the 16th and 17th centuries, built upon mathematical and astronomical foundations that had been established by Alexandrian scholars and preserved through Islamic intermediation. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks demonstrate the continuing relevance of Alexandrian mechanical knowledge, as his designs for flying machines, hydraulic systems, and automated devices drew upon principles that had been explored by Hero of Alexandria 15 centuries earlier. The recovery of Hero's texts during the Renaissance provided crucial inspiration for the technological innovations that would eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution. The printing press revolution of the 15th century represented a technological solution to the preservation challenges that had contributed to the library's vulnerability. While papyrus scrolls could be destroyed by fire, flood, or simple neglect, printed books could be reproduced in multiple copies that distributed preservation responsibility across many institutions and individuals. The printing revolution ensured that the type of comprehensive knowledge loss that occurred with Alexandria's destruction would be much more difficult to replicate in subsequent centuries. However, The digital revolution of the 21st century has created new parallels to the library's situation that deserve careful consideration. Just as the library concentrated vast amounts of knowledge within a single institution, modern digital systems increasingly centralize human knowledge within a small number of corporate-controlled platforms and servers. The vulnerability of these systems to cyber attacks, corporate decisions, or technological obsolescence creates preservation challenges that echo the risks that ultimately destroyed the Library of Alexandria. The recent loss of digital archives through server failures, corporate bankruptcies, and deliberate deletion demonstrates that digital preservation faces many of the same challenges that confronted ancient manuscript collections. The phenomenon of link rot, where digital resources become inaccessible through changes in web addresses or platform policies, represents a modern equivalent to the scroll decay that gradually eroded the library's collection over centuries of inadequate maintenance. Contemporary efforts to address these digital preservation challenges often draw explicit inspiration from the Library of Alexandria's mission and methods. The Internet Archive's ambitious goal of preserving all human knowledge in digital form directly parallels the Ptolemy's vision of collecting all significant texts within their Alexandrian institution. The archive's distributed preservation strategy, which maintains multiple copies of important materials in different geographical locations, represents a technological evolution of the library's copying programs that had produced duplicate scrolls to guard against loss. International collaboration in modern scholarship and research also reflects principles that were pioneered in the Library of Alexandria. The systematic sharing of research data, the collaborative development of scientific theories, and the translation of important works into multiple languages all echo the institutional practices that had made Alexandria the ancient world's premier center for learning and discovery. The European Organization for Nuclear Research, known as CERN, exemplifies how modern institutions continue the Alexandrian tradition of bringing together the world's brightest minds to pursue fundamental questions about the nature of reality. Like the ancient library, CERN provides resources and collaborative opportunities that no single nation could support independently, while fostering the type of international intellectual exchange that had characterized Alexandria during its golden age. The World Wide Web itself, invented at CERN, represents perhaps the most ambitious attempt since Alexandria to make all human knowledge universally accessible. Tim Berners-Lee's vision of an interconnected global information system directly parallels the library's goal of gathering and organizing all available knowledge within a single searchable collection. Climate change research provides another compelling example of how modern challenges require the type of comprehensive, collaborative approach that the Library of Alexandria had pioneered for ancient scholarship. Understanding global climate systems requires integrating data from multiple scientific disciplines, cultures, and historical periods in ways that echo the interdisciplinary synthesis that had flourished within the library's scholarly community. The preservation of indigenous knowledge systems, threatened by globalization and cultural assimilation, represents a contemporary equivalent to the library's translation programs that had preserved knowledge from disappearing civilizations. The preservation of indigenous knowledge systems, threatened by globalization and cultural assimilation, represents a contemporary equivalent to the library's translation programs that had preserved knowledge from disappearing civilizations. Modern ethnobotanists work urgently to document traditional medicinal knowledge before elderly practitioners pass away without transmitting their expertise to younger generations. This race against time mirrors the urgent acquisition efforts that Alexandrian scholars had undertaken to preserve knowledge from declining ancient civilizations. UNESCO's Memory of the World program, dedicated to preserving documentary heritage that is of significance to humanity, directly descends from the institutional mission that had driven the Library of Alexandria's comprehensive collection development. The program's recognition that certain documents and archives represent irreplaceable components of human memory. Echoes the Ptolemy's understanding that preserving knowledge required systematic, institutional commitment rather than relying on chance or individual initiative. The ongoing destruction of cultural heritage in conflict zones provides stark reminders of how quickly accumulated knowledge can vanish when political instability overwhelms institutional protections. The deliberate destruction of manuscripts in Timbuktu by extremist groups, the bombing of libraries and museums in Iraq and Syria, and the looting of archaeological sites worldwide demonstrate that the forces which destroyed the Library of Alexandria remain active threats to human cultural heritage. These contemporary losses help us understand that the library's destruction was not simply an ancient tragedy, but part of recurring patterns in human history where immediate political, religious, or economic interests override long-term commitments to knowledge preservation. The challenge of maintaining support for institutions whose benefits may not be immediately apparent to political leaders or general populations remains as relevant today as it was in Ptolemaic Egypt. The COVID-19 pandemic provided unexpected insights into how global crises can both threaten and strengthen international knowledge sharing. While the pandemic disrupted traditional scholarly collaboration and forced many libraries and archives to close temporarily, it also accelerated the development of digital collaboration tools and open access publication practices that made knowledge more widely available than ever before. This crisis response demonstrated both the vulnerability and resilience of modern knowledge systems. The rapid development of effective vaccines through unprecedented international scientific collaboration showed what becomes possible when the global research community applies Alexandrian principles of systematic knowledge sharing and collaborative investigation to urgent challenges. The willingness of research institutions to share data, coordinate studies, and accelerate publication processes during the pandemic created the type of international scholarly cooperation that had characterized the library's golden age. As we contemplate the full significance of the Library of Alexandria's history, we must recognize that its legacy extends far beyond the ancient world to influence fundamental questions about how human societies organize, preserve, and transmit knowledge across generations. The institution's rise and fall provide crucial insights into the conditions that enable intellectual flourishing and the forces that can destroy even the most remarkable cultural achievements. The library's story demonstrates that creating and maintaining centers of learning requires sustained political commitment, generous financial support, and protection against the forces of intolerance and narrow-minded prejudice. A Ptolemaic investment in scholarship represented more than royal patronage. It constituted a civilizational choice to prioritize long-term intellectual development over immediate political and economic advantages. The institution's international character and commitment to cross-cultural learning offer particularly relevant lessons for our increasingly interconnected, yet politically fragmented world. The library's systematic translation programs and collaborative research methodologies showed how bringing together diverse intellectual traditions can generate insights and innovations that transcend the limitations of any single cultural perspective. Perhaps most importantly, the library's history reveals both the extraordinary fragility and the remarkable persistence of human knowledge. Individual texts and entire intellectual traditions can vanish completely within a few generations of neglect or persecution. Yet the fundamental human drive to understand, explore, and preserve knowledge continues to manifest itself in new institutional forms and technological possibilities. The digital revolution has created unprecedented opportunities for preserving and sharing human knowledge, while also introducing new vulnerabilities that echo the challenges faced by ancient manuscript collections. Understanding the library's history can help contemporary societies develop more robust strategies for protecting intellectual heritage against both traditional threats like political instability and warfare, and emerging challenges like cyber attacks and technological obsolescence. As we face an uncertain future, marked by climate change, political polarization, and rapid technological transformation, the Library of Alexandria has vision of comprehensive knowledge collection and international scholarly collaboration offers both inspiration and practical guidance. The institution's commitment to preserving diverse intellectual traditions, while fostering innovative research, provides a model for how human societies can navigate complex challenges through systematic inquiry and collaborative problem-solving. The story of the Library of Alexandria ultimately reminds us that knowledge represents humanity's most precious inheritance and our greatest hope for addressing the challenges that confront each new generation. The scholars who worked within its halls understood that preserving and advancing human understanding required institutional commitment that transcended individual lifespans and political boundaries. Today, as we stand at another crucial juncture in human history, we bear the responsibility of ensuring that future generations inherit not only the knowledge we have preserved and discovered, but also the institutional wisdom and collaborative spirit that will enable them to continue the great work of understanding our world and our place within it. The Library of Alexandria may have vanished from the physical world, but its vision of universal knowledge and collaborative scholarship continues to inspire and guide humanity's ongoing quest for understanding. In every research library that welcomes international scholars, in every digital archive that preserves endangered texts, and in every collaborative research project that brings together diverse expertise to address common challenges, the spirit of Alexandria lives on. The greatest tribute we can pay to the memory of this remarkable institution is to continue its work of gathering, preserving, and sharing human knowledge, ensuring that future generations inherit not darkness and ignorance, but the full light of human understanding that once illuminated the ancient world from the shores of Alexandria.